great. I'm great. So the topic of the day is DUI checkpoints in Denver and Colorado at large, actually.
All right.
So the first question we have here, to get right into it, is if I get pulled over drinking, is there a way to avoid jail time?
Okay, this question goes to any DUI, really. But number one is don't have a second in 5 years. Don't have a second conviction in 5 years. It's going to carry a mandatory jail. As far as on the side of the road and that night, that officer has certain parameters he's going to do. If you're difficult and there's a bad feeling between you, yeah, he's more likely to put you in jail. But most likely, officers will deliver you to detox as long as it's a first offense, no prior convictions. If you have a prior conviction, most agencies are going to take you to jail, and you'll be able to bond out that night. But still, it's going to take you quite a time to get out of there. So really, it's going to rely on your history, things out of your control. I certainly think that people oftentimes think if they can be more forthcoming with an officer, that they're going to avoid jail time. And sometimes I think that's a little short-sighted, because the officer is going to use all those words against you. They're going to be confessions. And probably he's going to do the same thing anyway. He's already made his determination what he's going to do with you based on your history. So I'd say don't try and help it too much, because you're gonna give confessions. People tend to try and do that, try and say, listen, you got me. I know I'm drunk. Can't you just help me out here? Not going to happen. So that's a challenging one.
Bottom line, don't confess.
Yes.
Speak as little as possible. So is there a way to get jail time sentences reduced if you find yourself in the unfortunate situation of being in jail?
If you've been charged, the first thing you're going to do is go online and you're going to see all of these things that require jail. In our Colorado, there's being over 0.2 carries a mandatory minimum jail sentence. A prior offense in any time in your lifetime carries mandatory jail. A third carries mandatory jail as well, obviously. But in a lot of these circumstances, even if jail is required, there are alternatives to jail. There's if it's just a higher BAC, with some judges, you can get an ankle monitor instead of actual jail, or a second offense outside of 5 years. In those circumstances, I can get an ankle monitor too. When it's inside of 5 years, it's a mandatory minimum 10 days, and there's very little that anyone can do about that. If it's a third offense, it's mandatory minimum 60 days, and that's the minimum. But a lot of judges now, the way things are going in Colorado, people are pushing for felony charges after 3. So it's really a challenge if you got 2 priors to avoid a lengthy sentence. But
wow.
But you want to look at these things. Every case is different. Oftentimes people really get scared when they look at this and think about it. And I urge a lot of people. They're fact specific, so you should really talk to a lawyer and find out what exactly you're looking at. It's kind of like going on WebMD and just diagnosing yourself with everything that's going to kill you. It's going to scare you, and that's probably a bad idea. So maybe better talk to a lawyer. Most lawyers, like I do, offer a free consult for that. And a lot of times I find myself talking people off a ledge. The world isn't over. You're not going to go to jail. Sometimes I can tell them, well, it's unlikely based on these facts that you go to jail, and you can relax about that a little bit. I'll tell people those things often. Right.
That's good. So the next question is, I think I know the answer. Do you have to stop for DUI for police checkpoints?
Well, unlike a lot of movies that we see, you're not going to get very far if you don't. The constitutionality of DUI checkpoints is past muster. So that means that they can use them. There's certain parameters. First of all, they have to warn you it's coming. Secondly, they have to give you an alternate route if you don't wish to go through the checkpoint. But the practical reality is, where I see them set them up, they know where they're setting them up, and they make it so you really can't get out of it. And they have every enforcement agency setting these up are going to have what are called chasers. Police cars around. When they see somebody take a dramatic turn to get away from there, they're going to go get you. So if you see a checkpoint ahead of you, it's probably already too late, in my opinion. Though technically and constitutionally, they are supposed to allow you an alternative route if you don't choose to stop at the checkpoint. But they're pretty good at putting those markers, but when there's nowhere to turn off and there's no way to get out of it.
Got it.
So you're going to pull up, and you're going to get, and if you're seeing cars stopping in front of you, then you better stop too.
Okay, well, that brings up kind of a side question that I'm wondering personally, which is there's several apps and text message broadcast services that alert the public about DUI checkpoints, and it's been in the news that the police forces across the country and the world are not so thrilled about these apps and services. But from a legal standpoint, from where you sit, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that if somebody is smart enough to go online and check an app before they drive somewhere, that probably they're not intoxicated. So the reality is,
Yeah,
it's how if you're out drinking and you're drinking a lot and you pull out an app and check to make sure there's no roadblocks, you're an unusual person because most people aren't thinking like that, and their judgment's gone. That's why they end up making this mistake. It's a very common mistake that a lot of people make, and so I don't think that that's very likely. I mean, but it's not a bad idea if you've had a couple and but you're sober, you think you're okay, but you still want to be safe and check. Yeah, it's not a bad idea. But I find that when you rely on technology, sometimes it'll let you down, and this would be a bad spot to be let down on.
sure, absolutely. But
I guess
just in terms of what can a person do if they're a law-abiding citizen and they want to stay free? It's just something I was thinking of. So,
and I guess the number one thing would be if you're thinking like that, then Uber it or take a cab or call a friend, but do something.
Exactly. So the next question we have here is, what should I say when I'm stopped at a checkpoint?
Okay, well, they're going to ask for license registration, or they may stick their head in the car and say, "How are you tonight?" They're actively trained to smell the air coming out of your car. That's what they're doing, and so if they smell alcohol, they're going to proceed with the DUI investigation. But they can't ask you for license registration, and you have to give that. You have to provide that. At that juncture, the reality is if an officer asks you to do something and tells you have to, then you have to do it. I mean, even if you disagree, you're going to, if the officer says, I need you to step out of the car, even if you don't think you need to, I think you better obey the police officer's advice or order. But you can always ask them, well, do I have to, or is this voluntary, or is this mandatory? You might ask those questions, and if they say they are voluntary or not mandatory, you don't have to, then I would suggest you don't give them extra stuff. You don't comply.
Got it. Okay. And what am I obligated to do at the checkpoint?
Well, it depends on what the officer sees. Now, you have certain rights. An officer just can't make anyone you've already stopped your car, and they've determined that that's constitutional, but that's it. Now, so they can't just because they want to ask you to get out of your car, ask you to do roadsides, ask to look in your eyes, ask you to blow in a breath test, and they can't do that. That's extra. But the officer, from his perspective, he's entitled to, if he believes there's what's called reasonable suspicion, then he can detain you for a short time on the side of the road. And reasonable suspicion would be gained by seeing a pipe in plain view on a console, or an alcohol container in plain view, or smelling alcohol, or smelling marijuana, or having an admission. Well, have you had any drink tonight? Well, only 2. Or did you smoke any marijuana? Well, yeah, but a long time ago. Those kind of answers are going to give him reasonable suspicion to continue with his investigation. And it then can run on the line of, well, I need you to step out of the car. Then they're going to ask you, then they have the right to ask you to step out of the car, and you have to. The problem for the driver is you don't know what this officer is seeing and what observations he's made. So you don't know where you are on this continuum.
Got it.
So that's why I'm saying if the officer asks you to step out of the car, you're going to have to do it.
Right. So what shouldn't someone say when they're stopped at the checkpoint? What should they not say?
My legal advice to everyone is not to confess to committing a crime. And DUI, D or DUI, both are crimes. So my advice,
define what you mean by confess to committing a crime, because I think that's worthy of repeating.
Yeah, I guess I'd say it's an admission. As they say, everything you say can be used against you. Well, these kinds of admissions are going to be used. Everyone's going to say, well, I just had a couple drinks, but I'm okay. Well, that's actually whether you're okay or not. That part you don't really see in the reports. What you see is admits to drinking. and they're
Right.
already, then they've got a basis to detain you further right then and there. If you say, even if you say, well, it was hours ago, or whatever you say, it's like, well, you say that, but you've already admitted to drinking. Now I can go further with my case. So
Got
I
it.
would prefer people not to make those kinds of admissions because they're damaging.
Great. Great. That's good information. Next question is, does the amount of intoxication over the limit influence the sentence?
It can. In Colorado, anything over a 0.2 carries mandatory jail. As I think I was saying, you can get with those sentences. They're all alternatives that are available. You can get an ankle monitor in some circumstances with some judges. It's possible to get that, but still, with a high BAC, you could be looking at possible jail. Also, a BAC over 0.15, by statutory definition, you then become a quote unquote persistent drunk driver, even if it's your first with no priors. This is legislation that was passed a few years ago, and what it carries is enhanced probationary requirements, meaning monitored sobriety, longer probation, things like that. And then also a higher BAC makes it harder for me to try and get a plea deal, which carries, for example, getting from a DUI down to a DWAI, driving while impaired. I can do that, but if you're at a certain level, they're not going to agree to that unless I can think of a good reason why they should.
Great. And I think you touched on this before, but just to ask you, what are someone's options when they're pulled over? What should they be thinking in terms of, I can do this, this, or this, and
Okay.
this is my best avenue to take?
Okay, well, this is a very common question. If the officer asks you if you've been drinking, or he does tell you, I smell alcohol, have you been drinking tonight? They'll make it in a form of an accusation.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, my advice is not to admit that, but to simply say, well, I'm uncomfortable answering these kind of questions unless we get my lawyer on the phone, or I'd rather not answer any of these questions right now if that's okay with you. But he has the right to ask for your license, registration, proof of insurance. And let's face it, any kind of answer like that, he's gonna assume that the answer would be yes. But if you say yes, that's going to be used later. So I'd rather, you're not going to talk your way out of him proceeding with the case. If he smells alcohol, you have to remember that alcohol and driving, or marijuana and driving, are the number one law enforcement priorities right now on the road at night. That's what every officer is looking for. This isn't the way it used to be, where there's, they'll help you out. No, they are looking for this purpose. There are strictly DUI enforcement officers assigned only to this task, and they're going to do that task. So if they smell alcohol, smell marijuana, or if you admit that you had it, they're going to proceed with their investigation. You're not going to talk your way out of it. In that case, my own preference is that if they ask people to do roadsides, in my experience, a lot of people aren't going to pass those. A lot of people have physical ailments. You don't even know what they're looking for. And so my advice is not to do those, to ask if they're voluntary, and if that's indicated they are voluntary, then to decline to take them. Okay. Now, something common that's going to happen is they're going to they have a portable breath testing device that most law enforcement officers carry. This is different than the breath test, so that will confuse things too. If they ask you if you'll blow in this thing, if it's the breath test that they have right there on the side of the road, don't do that. Okay, that's only admissible against you.
How do you deny them? Because a lot of people are going to feel compelled to do whatever the officer says.
Yes.
Otherwise, they're going to go to jail. That's what would be in my mind. So, when you say don't do it, it could be said it's easier for you to say because you're an attorney. So how do you make that, translate that down to the common person? How does someone deny a police officer's request without going to jail? Yeah,
I think respectfully to ask, well, is that voluntary? And if yes, it's voluntary, but I need you to do it. If it's voluntary, then I'm respectfully going to decline.
Okay, that sounds perfectly reasonable, and I wouldn't have thought of that right off the cuff. So that's all we have for today. And thank you very much, Dave. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you.